Today is January 17th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm out for a walk on the road today, so I apologize for any distracting background noise or if at times I seem a little winded. As a Protestant who converted to Catholicism, I'm very sensitive to the spirit and thought of Protestantism. I'm very sensitive to the ideas and behaviors of Protestants because I myself was a Protestant and was quite well studied in Protestantism. As a convert also from modern scientific thinking, I'm sensitive to the spirit of modern secular academics and scientific thinking. Sorry, a school bus is passing. I'm sensitive to secular scientific thinking, just as I am to Protestant thinking. And what I've worked for over the past 20 years or so is to free myself from that way or from those ways of thinking so that I can think rightly according to the principles of the Catholic faith. And when I say principles of the Catholic faith, I mean according to the teachings of the sacred scriptures as they're interpreted by the Catholic Church, according to scholastic theology as we find it systematically articulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, and catechetically as we find the faith presented to us by the catechisms of the Church. I try to stick closely to the sources, as it were, to authoritative sources. And I try to study and think in a way that allows me to be confident that what I say, what I think, what I do is not merely in line with the words of the Church, but the intended meaning of those words as they're interpreted by the Church herself. And as I seek to do this, as I seek to think like this, and speak like this, and live like this, I'm sensitive to those who don't do so because I know how difficult it is to do so. I know how difficult it is to study and keep in mind these authoritative sources, how easy it is to just start babbling my own thoughts, opinions, feelings, judgments, and so on, how hard it is to resist that, to choose not to do that, but to seek to consult the sources and make sure that I'm thinking and speaking and acting according to the actual teaching of the Catholic Church. There's a proverb that says, in the midst of much speaking, sin is not lacking. St. James says, be slow to speak and quick to hear. We're taught that our words should be few. We should be careful in our speech because the truth is not something simple. The truth is not what we like to call common sense. The truth is obscure. It's difficult to distill from error, and it takes great pains for us to be able to think, speak, and act according to the truth. It's very difficult. When students take up the study of Aristotle, they find his works very difficult to read and understand, and it's because the truth, as he is working to explain it, as he's working to distinguish what's true from what appears to be true but is not in fact true, requires very careful language, very careful explanations, careful differentiations between slight differences in expressions, careful distinctions between different uses of the same words in different contexts, and how all of these confusing factors lead us into error, and how we can detangle all of these hairs, as it were, and separate the truth from the errors. These studies are difficult because the truth is not simple. The same is true when we study sacred scripture. Many say they don't read the Bible because they find it difficult to understand. And that's because the truth is not simple. The same is true when reading the writings of Thomas Aquinas, because he uses very careful technical language, because what he's trying to explain requires exactness that's very difficult to achieve without very careful restrictions on language. Sometimes the need to coin new terms is necessary because the truth is not simple, and it can't be assumed that we already know it. It comes with great pains, with great study. It requires great amounts of time and effort and attention to learn the truth. When a person is sensitive to this reality, they'll be careful to stick to the sources. They won't be very confident in their own judgment. In fact, the book of Proverbs warns us not to lean upon our own understanding. And so one way that we can know that something's wrong is to see a person acting with a confident spirit, rambling from the hip, as it were, showing no concern for providing evidence that what's being said agrees with the authoritative sources, but throws handfuls of stones, great complicated sentences and arguments filled with all kinds of tangled assumptions and assertions without any care to establish the truth of each thing that's said, each thing that's assumed, and so on. When we find a person who speaks like that, a person who shows us no history of careful study of these authoritative sources, who shows no respect for the complexity or obscurity of truth, but who pretends that everything is just simple and quote-unquote common sense, we can be sure that this person doesn't understand the truth and is just babbling a bunch of nonsense. We're to be slow to speak and quick to listen. And we should see that spirit of caution reflected in our mode of speaking. We should be careful to study first and speak after we've studied. We should be careful to gather the evidence first and have it on hand before we make the assertions. We should be careful to consult the sources and make sure we have the references to support what we state when we state it. And we'll very rarely find people who communicate in this way. So we have the wild, opinionated rambling of the ignorant and careless. But then we have the thinking of the Protestant, the thinking of the scientific, and some other recognizable groups. But what I'd like to say is that all of these false opinions, all of these people who speak against the true Catholic faith, which is preserved and promoted by the living hierarchy of the Catholic Church and no others, all of these people share a number of principles which identify them as companions in their errors. And what's interesting to me is that those who identify themselves as quote-unquote traditional Catholics share these principles with other groups who reject and speak against the Catholic faith. As one who was immersed in scientific studies and work and got accustomed to the thinking and speaking of that community, I'm sensitive to that spirit. And as one who spent 10 years or so carefully studying Protestant teaching, I'm very sensitive to that same spirit. And that spirit is present in those who criticize the hierarchy of the church, who speak against councils of the church, and identify as traditional Catholics. And I'd like to point out a few of their common principles, which I think mark them and distinguish them from obedient Catholics. First of all, if we look back in history, we find that the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation occurred at roughly the same time. And that's because those two movements were two parts, or I should say two applications, of a single movement. The greater movement was a worldwide rebellion against the Catholic Church. And most pointedly, a rebellion against the notion that there was authority in the Catholic Church. It was this concept of a divinely appointed authority that was rebelled against in the 15 and 1600s. And so on one hand, some rebelled against church authority by appealing to our ability to know the truth by the observation of the world with our own senses. And this was the foundation of the scientific revolution. We don't need philosophers. We don't need bishops or monks or popes. We don't need divine revelation to tell us how the natural world works or what its purposes are. We have our own senses and can search this out for ourselves. And so the scientific revolution, if you read the writings of Francis Bacon, was a rebellion against the ancient notion of authority. It was characterized by a spirit of disobedience. On the other hand, in another sphere, namely the religious, the Protestant Revolution was founded upon the same principle that we have no need of any human beings to tell us what to believe or what to do. We can enjoy direct access to God Himself through prayer, and we can access His revealed Word directly through the study of the Bible. And since we have the ability to pray to God directly, and we have the ability to read the Scriptures for ourselves, we have no need of any authoritative body of men to tell us what's true and false. We can search it out for ourselves. It's the same exact spirit in the scientific revolution, this spirit of disobedience, this rebellion against ancient authority. Rebellion against ancient authority which was established by God. In one of the movements, that rebellion was applied to knowledge of the natural world and its use. In the other movement, it was applied to religion, to the worship of God, and to some sort of religious privilege of organizing in the name of Christian community for whatever reason. But we can see that these two movements are two sides of the same coin. It's the same principle, the same spirit at work in both of them with two different applications. Now, when we fast forward to the 21st century, we find a new group acting with the same spirit of disobedience. In fact, arguing that disobedience, defiance of human authorities is actually the mark of true Christianity. We see that this two-sided movement has a political manifestation, and it also has a religious manifestation, just as these movements in the 16th and 17th centuries had. Because both of them turned into political movements, both of them influenced religion, and so on. And we find the same today, and the similarities are quite profound. First of all, the political aspect of this movement is found in American conservatism, which has risen up against what's called American liberalism as an opposite extreme. It does not have the support of the authority of the church and doesn't care. If we look at this crowd of people who identify as conservatives, we find that it makes no difference if you're Protestant or if you identify as Catholic. You share in the same spirit, which should be a red flag, but isn't. Because the interest in Catholicism is secondary. It's largely utilitarian. We see a good example of this in the person of Frank Pavone. Frank Pavone was a Catholic priest who got involved heavily and zealously in conservative American politics, and in his political zeal went beyond the teaching of the church. He moved beyond the teaching of the church and was eventually checked by the church and told to get in line with official church teaching. When he was made to choose between his political movement and his Catholic priesthood, he chose his political movement, revealing what he considered to be his priority. Unfortunately, the organization that he started was platformed on the appearance of being Catholic and was even named Priests for Life, and now this awkward situation has arisen where the leader of the Priests for Life isn't even a priest anymore. But that's okay, because the image is what's necessary. It can retain this image that this is some sort of Catholic political activity, even when it lacks the support of the hierarchy of the church. And if made to choose between one and the other, between the church and political action, between the sacramental ministry and a political organization, will prefer the political organization. It reveals the priorities. And this is the political manifestation of this spirit. Desires to identify as Catholic for what sociologists call mechanical solidarity, or an appearance of external solidarity, to have an impressive look politically as being some kind of great movement. But at the same time, not actually having the support or authorization of that organization. We saw this in the attempt to organize Catholics for Trump. Think about all the visuals. We had a bishop who was paraded around as sort of a formal recognizer of this group of Catholics. Bishop Vigano, who is retired and by no means represents the mind of the bishops of the Catholic Church, but the visual was what was desired. Just like President Trump standing in front of a church with a Bible, there was a needed visual that was just a means to a political end. And so we see this. I don't want to talk about the politics too much, but we see this political use of Catholicism to give an appearance of solidarity to influence democratic politics. And these people have no problem running with their political opinions beyond the warnings of the hierarchy of the church. It's a bizarre phenomenon. But what we see is they really don't believe in the authority of the hierarchy of the church, and they have no problem bad-mouthing that authority and claiming that the authority is simply wrong, that they simply don't know the truth, that they're liberals, they're deceived, and so on. And they say these things of the Pope and bishops of the church. Again, on the other side of the coin, if we move away from the political to the religious among Catholics, we find this traditional Catholic movement. And these are self-identifying individual Catholics. There's no real traditional Catholic community or anything that has any substantial identity or real community or organization. It's all self-identifying individuals. But these people have the same characteristics as those wrapped up in politics. These traditional Catholics have their own maverick leaders, just like the political Catholics had Frank Pavone and others like him. They have their canceled priests, as they're called, just like the political movement has its own canceled priests. They've got their own canceled priests, and if forced to choose between the Pope and the bishops or an individual priest, they side with the individual priest who shares their opinion. When it comes to religious worship and things like that, they don't care if they go beyond the judgment of the Pope and bishops. They claim that they don't need any living Pope or bishops to tell them what to do or how to worship God, because they have direct access to the instructions themselves. And they sort of loosely define these instructions as quote-unquote tradition. If we ask what exactly this tradition is, we'll find that it's not sacred scripture. We'll find that it's not the writings of the doctors of the Catholic Church. It's not the writings of scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas. This tradition is largely a historical, liturgical rite that was established at a certain point in church history by the living hierarchy of the church, and by that same authority was changed. And of course, this change took place at the Second Vatican Council, when the so-called Mass of the Ages, which was actually established as the ordinary form at the Council of Trent at the time of the Protestant Revolution, was replaced with the Mass established through the Second Vatican Council as the new ordinary form of the Mass. But what the Pope and bishops, what the cardinals, what this council has to say is irrelevant, because these people, like the scientists of the 15 and 1600s, like the Protestants of the 15 and 1600s, and like the political Catholics of the 21st century in America, they have no need of any hierarchy to tell them what to do. They can consult the tradition themselves. And just as the scientific people of the early modern age spoke of science and research, just as the Protestants spoke of the Bible, just as the political Catholics speak of the Constitution, these Catholics speak of tradition. And all that really boils down to is the liturgy established by the Council of Trent, which for some reason is unchangeable, even though it itself was the product of a change in church history. Now, these discussions usually wander into all kinds of wrangling. And there are people who spend all of their time, all of their energy, digging into ridiculous details in these arguments while neglecting the very clear principle that marks their departure from the truth. The issue that unites all of these different movements is a disregard for the authority of the living hierarchy of the Catholic Church. That's what these groups all have in common. Now, if that was just some insignificant quality that they happened to share, it might not be a big deal and they could brush it off. But the problem is that this quality that they share is the essential evil of what they do. They all share in this essential evil, this essential error. And this essential error is a rebellion against the authority of the living hierarchy of the Catholic Church. If you become familiar with the spirit, the ideas, and the words of the scientific revolution, you'll recognize the shared principles in the ideas and spirit and words of the Protestant Reformation. It's the same spirit. And likewise, if you listen to the conservative American political Catholics, listen to their ideas, pay attention to the spirit, and listen to their words, you'll find it's that same spirit. The enemy is the hierarchy of the church. And likewise, in this, again, self-proclaimed traditional Catholic liturgical rebellion, it's the same spirit, the same ideas, the same words. I can literally quote statements from scientists and reformers, replace science or the Bible with tradition, And it will be verbatim what is spoken today among those who rebel against the liturgical judgment of the church. And as I say these things, I want to make it crystal clear that contrary to all their complaining and arguing, the Tridentine Latin Mass is still approved by the Church. It's simply restricted to those who are authorized to celebrate it by the living hierarchical members of the Church. I celebrate the Latin Mass once a month at my Dominican chapter meeting at St. Joseph's Seminary here in Charlotte, where the priests at the seminary celebrate the traditional Mass. A seminary that was actually built and founded by our living bishop. There's no controversy between the bishop and the Latin Mass. At our monthly chapter meeting, we enter the chapel, we celebrate the Mass, and we leave. It's no big deal. So there's no actual controversy between the Latin Mass, between the Tridentine Mass, and the hierarchy, the living hierarchy of the Catholic Church. There's no controversy between them. The controversy is between the will of individual priests who have no authority to make the decisions or judgments that they make, individual Catholic laymen and women who have no authority to make the judgments and decisions they make, speaking against the living hierarchy of the Church. That's the controversy. The controversy is not between the Pope and bishops and the Tridentine Mass, or between the modern Mass and the Tridentine Mass. The controversy is between the hierarchy of the Church and defiant, subordinate Catholics who think that they have the right to make these decisions for themselves. That's the controversy. It's the same controversy that existed at the time of the scientific revolution, because obviously the hierarchy of the Church had no problem with scientific research. It had a problem with men like Galileo promoting radical ideas without any evidence and presenting them directly to the common people who had no means of confirming them or testing them. That was the controversy. It wasn't between the Church and science. It was between the Church and the use of science by sophistical men who had other ideas to promote. And we see the same thing today. We saw it during the COVID crisis, when all of a sudden the science was used as a club to try to beat people living in a democratic society into submission, which is certainly not the purpose of any science. The controversy during the Protestant Reformation was not between the Church and the Bible. It was between the Church and her authority to interpret the Bible and the desire of individual self-proclaimed Christians to interpret the Bible themselves and publish their interpretations. That was the controversy. So these controversies are always misrepresented. If the hierarchy of the church speaks against the conservative political Catholics, they're accused of being liberals, when they're certainly not liberals. And when the hierarchy of the church, when bishops or the Pope himself speaks against the use of the traditional Mass in a certain place, in certain circumstances, he's accused of being a modernist, when they're not modernists, and the controversy is a fake one. It's misrepresented. But what I find most interesting is that in all four of these movements, we find the same spirit. We find this same spirit which for some reason insists on identifying as Christian or even Catholic, and yet denies the authority of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. It's very bizarre. But these four movements all share this same spirit of hatred, and eager defiance against the living hierarchy of the church. Their words, their arguments, their statements almost seem to be copied and pasted, as if they're sharing each other's ideas. If they share each other's responses, they share each other's arguments. It's very bizarre. And I discuss these issues with all four of these different groups because I'm a classicist and a scholastic, so I dispute frequently with secular scientists. I'm a Catholic and I dispute with Protestants. I'm politically independent and am eager, as I said at the opening of this talk, to see that what I think and say and do actually aligns with the counsel of the Church. I'm moderate and independent politically, and I'm often disputing both with liberals and with the so-called conservatives. And liturgically, because I simply submit to the judgment of the hierarchy of the Church, I'm often not forced, but moved to respond to false statements and accusations made by the so-called traditional Catholics against the Pope and bishops, other priests, people who attend and worship in modern parishes, and so on. I interact with all four of these groups, and as I said, it's as if the arguments and ideas are copied and pasted and shared from one group to the other. It's the same exact principles with four different applications. And if you are one of these people, if you are, you probably wouldn't have listened this far into the talk. But if you are one of these people, if you are the kind of person that identifies with one of these four groups, I encourage you to doubt yourself. I encourage you to doubt yourself. I encourage you to consider how difficult it is to study the philosophical writings of Aristotle and judge yourself to be a scientist, when I'm quite confident that you haven't yet studied and tested ancient philosophy. And that should be a red flag to you. And if you did pick up the study of ancient philosophy, you won't find it very easy. In fact, I don't think you'd progress very far at all. That should be a red flag to be careful that you don't run ahead of the church and think that you're ready to start speaking against the judgment of the hierarchy of the church. Likewise, if you're a Protestant, I'd like you to challenge you to consider what sources have you consulted to guide your understanding of sacred scripture. Are they limited to Protestant sources? And if they are limited to Protestant sources, that should be a red flag to you, because Protestantism didn't exist before the 1500s. Have you consulted the writings of early Christians like St. Augustine, St. John Chrysostom? Have you made an effort to study the classical languages, to question whether the arguments that are made from the languages by Protestants are actually sound arguments coming from the languages and not simply abuses of language studies to try to make an argument that doesn't actually exist? Have you actually taken time to study the Catechism of the Catholic Church or the Summa Theologica of St. Thomas Aquinas? Have you ever listened to talks given by Dominican teachers in the Catholic Church? If not, your protest against Catholicism should have some red flags for you. Likewise, if you're racing along, caught up in the zeal of a political movement, and you look around and find that your theological enemies have somehow ended up as your political partners, that should be a red flag to you. If you find that you're more concerned with being approved by the members of your political group than you are of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, that should be a red flag for you. If you watch as the church strips leaders of your political organizations of their priestly ministry, that should be a red flag for you. And lastly, if you're somehow caught up in this so-called traditional Catholic movement, I don't even know if it's a movement, it's largely online, but if you find yourself talking about tradition as if you are some sort of authority on such matters and have no need of any church authority to guide you, but speak about authority in the same way that Protestants speak about the Bible, that should be a red flag for you. If you would be willing to speak negatively of a Mass where the Eucharist is consecrated and Christ is made present, and you have something negative to say about that ritual, that liturgy, the fact that Christ is present where you swear you would never be present should be a red flag for you. So I hope that this talk, again, I doubt that anyone who belongs to one of these four groups would have listened to this point. But if you have, I simply ask that you be careful. Pump the brakes and ask some questions before you get too far down one of these rivers and can't make your way out of it. I hope that's helpful.